Hello and welcome to Startup Kitchen Talks, where we speak with master chefs and we learn the recipes for success. Today we're with JessicaBurley. She's an investor at Planet A Ventures. It's a leading climate fund, a European climate VC fund. Jess is an active member of the climate ecosystem. She's leading several local community initiatives in Berlin. And prior to that, she was studying politics and international relations at Cambridge University. So shout out to a fellow Cantabrigian. And she worked as a climate innovation researcher for the United Nations Development Programme. Recently, Jess and the team at Planet A teamed up with Speed Invest and Norskin VC to write the Climate Hardware Scaling Playbook. It's a comprehensive guide for hardware founders to navigate the complexities of scaling their technology in the context of climate change. And I have read this, and it's a huge, it's an incredible work for founders out there and a fantastic resource. So highly recommended. And today, Startup Kitchen is a traveling kitchen. So we're recording this episode from Slush Conference in Helsinki. Slush is living up to its name. There's snow outside on the ground. And you'll probably hear that my voice as a host is a little bit worn, and it might be to do with some of the karaoke and that was happening last night. And I think, Jess, that I even saw you. So welcome to the show. And I think I might have seen someone who strangely resembled you at the karaoke last night singing Dancing Queen.
Thanks a lot for having me. It could have been me.
Okay. Okay, we'll leave that and we'll leave the mystery.
And thanks also for the warm intro and the kind words on the hardware playbook. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So hardware is the theme for today. Today's episode is really for all of the hardcore hardware founders out there. We're going to talk about the challenges of scaling hardware. We're going to touch briefly also on climate tech in general and kind of talk about it in the wake of recent political developments. So we're recording this in November 2024. Trump has just been elected 2 weeks ago, and we're going to dig a little bit further into how Jess feels about that. But starting with a bit of setting the scene. So how are you enjoying Slush, Jess? I saw you up on the stage today. It sounded great.
Thanks. Yeah, Slush, as you said, has fulfilled its role of bringing us slush outside. It's my first time, but loving it. A lot of great energy, great people.
Yeah, absolutely. What were you talking about today on the Google stage?
It's a bit of a repeat. So I was talking about hardware. Got my first sort of practice session in so that I could be prepped for today.
Brilliant, brilliant. Yes, well, I hope that we can translate that into a nice kind of bite-sized piece today. I think it's going to be a bit of a shorter session because we are in a studio here in the venue. And we're going to maybe make this about a 30-minute conversation so that we can make something more digestible for the slush goers out there. So a quick intro, like how did you find your way into climate investing, and also why hardware?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So as you mentioned, my background was originally more the policy side, but I personally found I was driven to do something a little bit faster paced, where you can see your own individual impact. Have so much respect for those guys. I think policy is critical for moving the climate space whatsoever. But so I went from a huge organization into a tiny startup in circular economy in Berlin. And unfortunately found that it was pretty hard to raise and realized the importance of VC through that experience, and then joined a micro fund, which was actually more Lawrence Leichner, the founder of Tier Mobility and Rebuy, his own personal wealth investing into climate. And so we invested into 16 companies together over a year, and I learned a lot about VC through that, and also met Planet A, where I've been for a bit over 2.5 years now. And yeah, so with hardware, we were investing in hardware at the last fund and also at this one. So it's always been a bit of a topic for us, but we found there wasn't so much in terms of guidance or a playbook, if you like, and a lot more VCs were looking into it. But unlike software, where you have all of these sort of napkins and articles and so much learnings to share with the founders, that there was a really big gap in that. So that's why we partnered up. Actually, each individual fund was thinking of doing their own playbook, and then we realized and thought better to collaborate. And so that was the sort of formation moment of the hardware playbook. We worked on it over the last couple of years, and now, yeah, trying to spread the word.
Yeah, it was a fantastic resource. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about a bit of a takeaway, a bit of a TLDR of why did you make this? Why do we need it?
Yeah, totally. So the idea is, I mean, it's really a community effort. So we did dozens of interviews with founders and investors who had more exposure to it than us. We also did a survey with over 100 investors and almost 150 founders. And then worked also with Net Zero Insights. So we got 3,600 different funding rounds that we could analyze the data of to draw out some insights on what kind of works. And yeah, the reason is really that there's still this huge gap in financing for climate hardware. And I think a large part of it's actually also the lack of understanding of what to be looking for and how to de-risk and what sort of team composition makes sense, what business models make sense. And so investors are not able to do a proper risk assessment, and then founders also don't know how to structure and scale. So that's why we increasingly are seeing now more resources on this, but we at the time were keen to make a resource whatsoever, and now the ecosystem is developing, but I think it's quite still a gap in the market.
And what's at the core of this? Like, why is hardware hard, and why do most VCs hate hardware?
It's a great question. Yeah, so I think there's firstly quite a few structural challenges with hardware compared to software. So they do have a lot longer development timelines, and structurally VCs are not the most patient of capital. And they also have really high capital expenditure requirements. And then also the margins tend to be significantly smaller than with software, which is mostly just spending on OpEx. And I think one of the biggest challenges still for founders from our survey, 91% of founders found that there was a gap in growth funding. So there's still this sort of valley of death. And then, I think on the other hand, it's also a huge opportunity right now because we're increasingly seeing support through non-dilutive funding, and private ecosystem is growing. Also regulatory changes and talent is pushing it, as well as more demand and pull factors from the market and so on. So it's really a perfect timing, I think, of perfect combination, a storm ready for climate hardware to take off.
I also feel this kind of changing of tides and momentum, but in essence, it feels like it's a structural problem with how VCs are structured. And I know us as a kind of early stage impact VC, we're doing climate, but we have to do it at the very kind of ideation stages, because as you said, once it gets past those stages, then it starts to become very capital intensive, and we're just not structured for it. So then the follow-up to that is, like, do you think coming with all of these kind of momentum changes of regulation and founders wanting to do these kind of startups, is there a bit of VC appetite? Also a structural change in the way that VCs are starting to look like to do climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely think there's a gap in the market for certain funds focused on, for example, first-of-a-kind financing. But in general, I think it's more a question of creative capital stacks. So really combining that equity and VC financing with different forms. So particularly at early stages, we see a lot of non-dilutive grants and so on. And then I think there's this perfect time for VCs to enter quite early stage, but when the technology is a bit more developed, so the development timeline is not, 20 years out, but rather only 5 to 10 to get to mass scale. And then beyond that, we also see role for debt financing and also strategic investors at the slightly more growth stages. I think strategics, as long as they're not taking a majority shareholding, can be really useful from Series A+, because they bring distribution channels, a bit more commercial expertise, and they also then get access to these innovators. So it's sort of a double benefit there. I think I can see definitely a role with the current setup of how VCs are structured to still participate in investing in climate hardware. Yeah.
And I should preface this a little bit to say that I know we're saying climate because both Jess and I are climate-focused investors, but we can generalize this to hardware in general, right? It's the same process, the same stages. So you're seeing more of a willingness for different capital providers to come together and kind of blend this stack together to get this thing bankable, right? That's the goal, hey, to become bankable.
Yes, absolutely, and then the bank take over.
Yeah. So what are their challenges that they need to consider? Because, okay, for me, this capital stack thing, it's fundamental. I totally agree, but it's a product of the business model. They can choose to do a series of different business models of manufacturing, of licensing from day one, toll manufacturing. These things are quite asset light, all the way to having full production and manufacturing themselves. So in my mind, like, the capital stack that you need is a product of this business model decision, which has to happen actually pretty early, because it then determines your access to capital and how investors perceive you. So, like, what advice do you have for founders as they face this daunting business model decision?
Yes, totally. I think people don't discuss the business model as much as we should. And it's also different archetypes, right? We have, I think, been discussing, or at least in my head, a lot of deep tech hardware, where there's also actually more hybrid models where you combine it with software platforms, and maybe it's more commercialized hardware. But in general, I think it's quite hard to give one piece of advice for all startups, because it really is it really is very dependent. And actually, from the surveys of our investors, first they pointed to the business model is a major reason for why they are reluctant to invest in hardware companies. But second, they about 60% of investors said they were open to any model of business model. So it was a bit unclear results. But there was still a preference somewhat for licensing and more service-orientated models over project-based. And I think in general, of course, it has to be tailored to your technology, your market, and your customer needs. But overall, founders should focus on business models that minimize capital intensity and maximize the potential for recurring revenue streams. I think licensing is also often relied on for that potential for recurring revenue streams. But it's hard to start out with that. So I think a lot of founders often put in their deck that next year they're going to license their technology, but really you need a whole bunch of iterations and a lot of operational hours before you can get there. So it's more a long-term vision. And I think also you need to consider the market maturity. So the vertical integration is completely dependent on how mature your market is. Yes. And licensing is great in established markets, such as replacing a step in the production of green cement, or somehow simplifying the supply chain. But if you're in an emerging market, you really need a full stack model. So something like carbon utilization, the rest of the value chain is completely not there. So you actually have to build it. And we've seen that a lot historically with companies building out that now mean newer companies in, for example, electric vehicles can go in with just doing a part of it. But historically, you might have had to build the whole one. One strategic angle that we did find quite interesting or exciting was having more a portfolio approach, so positioning as an R&D or a product development platform rather than the manufacturer yourself, as that kind of gives you a lot more options for future.
Yeah. To touch on your licensing comment, I 100% agree that sometimes founders can be a little bit naive. They think that they're, as long as they're able to prove something on a demonstration, in a demo facility, then they will be able to integrate it into the supply chains of customers. And in my experience, customers are just, producers are just not willing to invest into this hardware or even give it a shot unless you can prove by delivering them a product that's able to be piloted, that they will actually begin to invest. So there is almost a kind of valley of death in my experience in there. I was just an hour ago talking to a founder exactly about this and trying to figure out ways that we could bridge that gap to try to make it easier for producers and manufacturers to integrate their product into their production lines without having these big capex expenditures or having to buy, especially when the hardware is asset very specific and it only is able to be used for that. It's a big risk for these producers, and they're not all willing to take that. So that's also a kind of valley of death that I've observed personally.
Yeah, absolutely. These guys are very conservative. They don't want to take on the risk themselves. They're really looking for you to have mature and demonstrated technology. That being said, they are also sometimes willing to collaborate with co-developments or pilot, or there's ways to also yeah, to collaborate with them, especially if you target customers and connect with those who deeply understand the problem, and that really helps speed up the progress. If it's a really huge pain point for them, they are usually more willing to make that initial investment, maybe as a strategic in your company, and then they can be more collaborative.
Yeah, and I know, with a lot of SaaS companies, you mentioned strategic investors. A lot of SaaS companies, we're often telling them to avoid strategic investment because it limits their exit paths, and it starts to guide their future product development maybe too early. And I know that specifically with hardware, it can be totally different. Like if you get one customer, which is that invested into you, that they want to actually help to pilot your technology and mature it. And then as long as you have enough flexibility built in, it feels like actually strategics can be total angels in this scenario when it comes to hardware.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's obviously a case by case. You still need to be very careful with the terms you sign. And there's some industries where customers are very competitive and won't want to work with you if you have a strategic with a huge ownership or information rights, etc. But if you can structure it in a way that they're not taking a huge chunk, but rather maybe a follower investor or investor at a later stage where there's not such an opportunity to take such a large percentage, they can be, as you said, angels in this.
Yeah. Okay, so then you've talked about certain aspects of what venture capital funds might look at when they're saying, is this kind of ready for us? Is this ready to scale? So what are you looking for when you come across a hardware startup and you're saying, has this come far enough in its journey of maturity to the point where it's a VC investment and not something that should be receiving earlier stages of financing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's multiple parts to that. So first, it's important to sort of time your fundraising with your de-risking of the technology, both in terms of technology readiness level and also of like market viability. And from our surveys, we found that, and also from the data points from Net Zero Insights, that revenue actually remains pretty elusive for the earlier stages. So you have to find ways of showing the market viability and traction in non-dollar terms. So some things that we've seen really successful are, of course, letters of intent, pilots, corporate partnerships that I think we just discussed, but also pre-order agreements and offtake agreements are really critical here. So those are the main sort of pieces of traction that we think are really critical to know when a startup is ready to scale.
Okay, I'm going to go off piece here and ask a question that we didn't discuss beforehand, but offtake agreements. It's a big topic of discussion with one of my portfolio companies at the moment. And, the wrong terms can kind of vary because there are penalties if you don't deliver on offtake agreements. So what are your kind of considerations? How do you look, how would you advise that founders go about putting together the right offtake agreements to not get themselves into hot water over-promising something? Because you need to buy yourself a bit of flexibility for the unknown as well.
Oh yeah, this is super critical also for the bankability part of your hardware, because you really need these to prove bankability. Yep. So I think there's multiple things here. Probably the primary ones are the timing. So you have to always remember negotiation takes up to like 18 months for these sorts of things. And so you need to start thinking about this from really day one and already engaging with those potential buyers. Another important part of not necessarily structuring this, but targeting it, is to find buyers who are creditworthy, because the banks will really care about that part as well. So you need to look into their own profitability and credit ratings and so on. And potentially also diversify it by having a few different off-takers and getting insurance. Another one is the pricing. So as you said, that's like quite tricky for early stage startups to know what's standard and not. So I really advise to talk to peers in your area to see what is typical. But we tend to see fixed prices with escalations of around 3%. And a really smart strategy is where players negotiate for direct access to the off-taker revenue. So this means lenders don't only secure the loan with like off-take agreements, but also get direct preferential access to the revenue generated. It's a win-win because it ensures that you get the loan servicing quite timely, but you also align the project and the lender interests. And then the other final thing about structuring it is it's pretty important to get them really long term. So over 10 years should be the aim, so that you can guarantee that continuous cash flow.
Okay, that was an extremely sophisticated answer for a question we didn't prepare for beforehand. I almost feel like you've done this before. Okay, solid, really, really solid advice. So moving to success stories, and maybe some less successful stories. So let's start with the struggling, actually. Why, give us maybe some examples. And I want to keep this European because we try to keep it local for listeners. What are some examples you've seen where maybe founders have made a misstep or have struggled with something in hardware scaling? And are there some kind of learning, some takeaways that we might get from this?
Yes, actually, luckily not yet from our own portfolio. So I'm sure that will come. Otherwise, we're in the wrong business, right? We should be in PE if we're not seeing any failures. But maybe to look at like the wider historical picture, because we looked quite a lot at clean tech 1.0 companies that failed, which were both in Europe and in the US. But in general, a lot of them overestimated market demand. And they were then undercut also by products manufactured in China, and they weren't really economically viable. I think the main learnings from that, first of all, we have slightly different times. There's more regulatory pressure. The world is more ready for these technologies. And other than that, for critical learnings for the startups themselves, I think it's really important to, as we said already many times, but it's really important to target your customers early and really test that there is a viable market here, rather than just assuming it. And then obviously, as we said as well, collaborating with bigger players in the market can help overcome those market entry barriers. And then finally, of course, most important thing is always about achieving cost parity. So that was really, from all our surveys, that was the number one thing that customers are looking for, is really price.
Yeah, we see this a lot as a kind of founder naivety of just because it's more sustainable, customers should be willing to pay more for it. And often they're not. They like that it's more sustainable, but it has to be cost comparable or cost competitive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we found sustainability came about fourth in terms of priorities, with definite outperformance of cost, and then other things like quality and durability being even higher.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And now on to more positive success stories from Europe. And, what can we take away? What can we learn from that? And this is an opportunity for you to humbly brag about your Planet A portfolio.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, I do love to talk about my my portfolio. So I will jump into that one. Yeah, so it's still early days, but what's tracking really well, and I think a great example because it highlights a lot of the stuff we found in the playbook, is C1 or Carbon 1. So they have a chemical or quantum chemical simulation platform to develop new materials. Their first one is an efficient catalyst to create green methanol at scale. So the way that they tick the box in terms of the hardware playbook is, first of all, the team composition. So the founding team combines both the deep tech scientists as well as entrepreneurial company building and fundraising excellence. So you have people representing both and working together so that you really work on this commercial part from day one and don't sort of put it off until it's already too late. And they really already started from day one engaging with those customers, and now already also have an investment from Maersk, which is the dominant buyer in green methanol. So they directly invested into Carbon 1 and have committed to sort of supporting it via that direct investment, not officially, but informally. And then the other part is really to de-risk and timing the fundraising with the de-risking. So first they did their pilot plant, and then raised based off of that, raised their seed, and then they've done their Series A, and now they're going to build their first of a kind plant. So really timing it really well so that they can prove out their solution as they raise. And then finally, the last part we were talking about, the cost parity. So currently, for any green methanol, you have to pay 3 times as much as you pay for normal methanol. And so they're in a, obviously, when you start out, you're going to be a little bit more expensive, but they have cost parity with insight and shouldn't, with realistic assumptions. And maybe the final one, I mean, first, okay, two more. First, their business model is mentioned, so they're actually a platform for simulating new materials. So they have like this portfolio approach and can, build out more innovation from there. And then finally, they're not actually reinventing the wheel. So 100% of their equipment is off the shelf. They just innovate the catalyst, which keeps their first of a kind costs a fraction of what we see for others.
Okay.
So yeah, they really tick a lot of the boxes there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm very happy for them, and it's a breakthrough to have a Maersk, in your corner. That's kind of the time where you're flying, I think. Okay, so before we move away from this hardware scaling playbook, do you have any kind of last tips as we move, especially from this first of a kind stage to then going further, going to this kind of nth of a kind and becoming bankable and repeatable? Do you have any other tips that you want to share or key takeaways from the playbook?
Yeah, I think we covered most of them. I think debt is really a necessity, which we didn't talk about too much. So we talked a little bit about offtakes being critical to bankability, but also that they really need that bankability because otherwise it's not going to be possible to finance your capex without it. And I think also that there are interesting business models in terms of innovation on the financing as well. So you can build SPVs or asset cos, and these are some interesting approaches that we've been seeing as well. And then, yeah, I think we didn't mention too much, maybe a little at the beginning, but grants are super important. So we found actually up to 50% of your total financing at early stages were from grants. And then at later stages, we say that grants are called subsidies when you get to a later stage, but they're still very important.
But they're still important.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of companies struggle with their kind of in between that folk to nog, first of a kind to nth of a kind, from trying to use equity financing to finance, something that they want to get to debt financing, but they're not quite bankable, but the amount is just too large to be, to either the valuations have to be extremely high of the companies and they just don't warrant it at that stage, or the dilution is extremely high and that sets a path of trouble ahead. So they can get stuck in and have you seen that? Have you seen companies getting stuck there, and how are they breaking through that puzzle?
Yes, totally. I think that's really the value of Jeff that we've been talking about. I'm hoping to see more funds coming in to step in there. But it can be mitigated. I think it's often when you get to that point, it's a little bit too late. Actually, you need to be starting quite early to already have enough tech de-risking and timing it correctly to make sure that you can actually raise that equity and or enough offtakes and debt de-risking so that you can get that bankability. But when you're at that stage, it is a pretty sticky one. It's hard to get out of.
Yeah, it is. And we've seen all sorts of, EIC grants and, crazy rounds with VCs. Some of them do the high valuations and manage to ride it out. And back to what you said about, is it different this time with the clean tech? We also did the kind of looking backwards in the history, and our conclusion is yes. Things are different now, and we're also bullish that this is a good time to be investing in climate hardware.
Absolutely.
But that takes us to our next topic, which is it a good time? So, okay, let's, talking about climate in general, let's start with talking about what areas are you excited about right now? What are you looking at? What's Planet A kind of got on their radar?
Yeah, totally. I mean, actually, I think I'm often surprised by the innovation in the market. So when I build a thesis, I'm always, I'm never going to be the one who's coming up with the ideas myself, so I actually stay quite open to those at the front of cutting edge to tell me what's going to be hot next. But in general, I think I focus mostly on energy within the team, and the fact is that renewables are they're fantastically able to get very cheap, but they're always a bit volatile. So often we're looking still for economically viable baseload technologies, as well as long duration energy storage and grid balancing. And also we see a need still for innovation on industrial cooling and high temperature heat, which are huge parts of the global emission and still have not really been solved. But in general, pretty open to different solutions. But maybe back to your initial point, I think totally agree with you, it being the perfect timing. I think there's never been a better time to invest in climate hardware.
Yeah, and it seems to be in Germany, where you're based, that there's becoming a little bit of a hotspot of climate innovation as well.
Yeah, I like to think so. There's hotspots all over Europe, but for sure, Germany has a lot of talent.
Okay. And as I said, 2 weeks ago, Trump was elected. He made a lot of comments in his campaign about his views towards not just climate in general, but towards how it was funded. And I feel like there is a sentiment that came with that, that is kind of that this is an excess, and this is something that needs to be deprioritized in light of some other pressing issues in the world around war and trade. And so it's a little bit concerning, and I wonder, how do you see the implications of this for us in Europe, for US, and for climate and hardware innovation in general?
You know what? I'm actually more concerned about climate change than I am about climate technology from Trump coming in, because I think the non-cherry-coated reality is that he is got control of the Senate and the House, and he's planning to deregulate, and he's planning to open up protected lands to oil and gas, despite being already the largest producer in the world. And that is just devastating for climate and for our goals to stay within. Definitely not 1.5, but even more. I think it's really very scary. But then in terms of actual clean technologies, I think, of course, rolling back the IRA will reduce some of the outlook, but he can't really touch the cost curves, which have come down massively. And as we've been saying already, most of the technologies that we're looking at are ones that will be price parity and are then also better and eventually also cheaper, because usually they require things that are not finite, right? Renewable. And I think this will continue that exponential growth. And then in terms of, commitment to climate, we definitely do see like other priorities coming up. I think it's important to see most of these technologies as actually security, that it's not just security is building out weapons, but security is having your own supply of food and energy and the critical things. And these require clean technologies. And then also the new commission in Europe, I think it kind of went a bit overlooked, but they've really re-established their commitment to energy security and climate. And then beyond that, also, there's some positivity I'm seeing in that the Fed and the ECB are both cutting interest rates. So that's historically been really great for hardware financing. Yeah.
Okay. I also see your kind of optimism. Okay, first, I agree with the pessimism that I think in general, when the biggest polluters stop caring and the solutions are not quite ready for them to, on a purely rational economic decision-making perspective, be more sustainable, then it is a problem for our kind of efforts to try to slow down the rate of change of greenhouse gas emissions. However, I think the silver lining in this that you're hinting on is that Europe might become the climate tech innovation capital of the world from this. I hope.
I hope so too.
Yeah, because I wanted to part with some optimism, so I want to put you on the spot. Jess, tell us something optimistic.
Yeah, I could tell you something optimistic. Yeah, I mean, I have heard from a few founders that they're now not thinking to go to the US as much as they were before.
Yes.
Whereas before there was a lot of topic around getting the huge grants in the US. I imagine that it will be the same for US founders, seeing grants over here, and also and potentially also VCs. I'm not sure. We'll have to see how it all plays out. I don't think that the climate US VCs have completely given up on the US. I think they also see the potential of these technologies to continue scaling with the cost curves being so exponential. But we'll have to see.
I think I noticed even a kind of microcosm of that is the number of American climate investors that are here today at Slush. It seems to be quite unprecedented. So we're going to sign off there. Time is running up on us. We promised you a shorter episode today. So Where can the listeners kind of continue to follow your progress, Jess, and where can they learn more about what you and Planet A and with your climate hardware playbook, what you're working on?
Yeah, the best place is probably to reach out on LinkedIn. It's where I'm most active. And also Planet A website, we list our medium, and we're also pretty active on LinkedIn as well. So
Brilliant.
yeah.
Yeah, and I, again, shout out to the climate hardware scaling playbook. I really advise both investors and founders to check it out. It's a great resource. So thank you so much, Jess. Enjoy the rest of your Slush time. Thanks for making time during Slush. I know you can probably hear the noise, listeners, in the background. Hopefully not too much. But yeah, thank you for making time.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, cheers.
Cheers.